Hello and welcome to today's RRC webcast on evaluating model risk. To receive a copy of today's presentation, please send a request to reply@rrc@riskreg.com. To ask a question during the meeting, type your inquiry into the Q&A panel to the right of your screen. We will respond to all questions after the session unless time permits at the end of the session. To answer polling questions, click on the radio button to the left of your desired response, then click Submit to record your response. For technical assistance, click the Help widget at the bottom of your screen. Today's presentation will be recorded. For CRE eligibility, log into the webcast with your first and last name and email address. Remain on the webcast for a minimum of 50 minutes. Participate in 80% of polling questions. To answer a polling question, click on the radio button to the left of your desired response, then click Submit to record your answer. You do not need to have the correct answer, but must participate to receive credit. Complete the course participation survey. For attendees participating in a group, designate one proctor to log in as an individual on behalf of the group, then complete and submit the group sign-in form within 24 hours of the event's conclusion. The form can be downloaded from the resource list on the right of your screen. Complete and submit the course participation survey. The form can be accessed from the resource list on the right of your screen. One CRE credit will be issued to eligible participants within 30 days. RRC will not issue credit if all criteria are not met without exception.
Today's presenters are Tricia Matson and Dave Heppen. Tricia is an actuarial partner at RRC. Her key areas of expertise include financial reporting, reserving, enterprise risk management, internal capital models, and regulatory requirements. She serves as a member on several Academy committees. She's authored and spoken on various topics, including risk management, including authoring, co-authoring several Academy practice notes and white papers on financial reporting and ERM topics. Our second presenter is Dave Heppen, who is an actuarial partner at RRC. His key areas of expertise include ERM, financial reporting, reinsurance, and the use of complex models and rate making and reserving. He's the chair of the American Academies of Actuaries, ERM and ORSA Committee, and chair of AA's American Academy of Actuaries Work and Compensation Committee, and member of various other committees. He's a frequent speaker at industry conferences, and he's author of numerous publications on property and casualty risks. I'll now turn the presentation over to Tricia. Tricia?
Thanks, Jennifer. So to start us off here, we're just going to try to know our audience a little bit. So we've got our first polling question. So I'll just ask that folks go ahead and let us know your background. Are you a financial examiner, a data analyst or specialist, a market regulation examiner, an actuary, or other? So you can go ahead and click on one of those and hit the submit button. And then we'll be able to see here in a second what our audience mix looks like. Okay, so I see we have a lot of financial examiners here, but also some other folks, including some actuaries. Let's see. So I did want to just give a little bit of background on the objectives for our presentation today, and also just kind of comment on, sort of why we care. So you do happen to have two actuaries presenting, but I think it's important to point out that model risk is not an actuarial thing. I mean, it certainly touches on actuarial work very, very significantly, but if done right, model risk and model risk management is something that a company should be elevating all the way to the board level, and model risk and model risk management should be considered across the organization. So it can often be true in an insurance company that model risk may be highest in the actuarial area because the actuaries use lots and lots of models, but there are lots of models used in other areas. Investments is a great example, forecasting, planning, risk management, et cetera. So our goal today is to talk about this more broadly. We'll talk about where we see risk in the industry, how to spot it as we're supervising our companies, some of the risk mitigation practices that we would expect to see in the industry, and then what happens if we see residual risk that's not mitigated and ways we might be able to test to see if model risk is significant in driving losses for the company or potentially driving losses. So why is this such a hot topic? And you know, this is not brand new. We certainly have been talking about model risk for a while, but there's a lot of things that have been happening in these past, I don't know, 5, 10, 15 years that have increased the use of models at organizations, increased the possibility that those models are in error for some reason, and then increased the extent to which companies are paying attention and trying to mitigate that more significantly. There's a lot more going on in terms of the complexity of the products. We have a lot of unique products with capital markets guarantees, hedging, optionality by the policyholder, different underwriting methods that use very, very complex models, different rating methods that use complex models, and then added to that, there's been a lot of change in the regulatory requirements, and some of those are driven by the need to better capture the risk in those complex products. Obviously, we have principles-based reserves upon us now. Many companies spending a lot of time on the changes in GAAP and IFRS accounting for insurance contracts, long-duration insurance contracts. And then there's been a lot of advancement, as we know, in risk management, which has been great. But as a result, complex models might be used for key decisions, and therefore it's very important to have good documentation, validation, and inventory, increased involvement of the second line of defense, namely ERM, the third line of defense, namely internal audit. And with that, I'll pause for a minute and let Dave provide some commentary on his perspective as well.
All right, thanks, Tricia. Hello to all, and thank you for joining us. And you know, I come at this from the P&C side, and what I've seen from the P&C side, it's very much in line with what Tricia was just talking about. And in particular, it seems like no matter what aspect of an insurance company's operations you're talking about, the modeling is there. The complexity of the modeling continues to grow. We've had predictive models for quite a while now, starting off on the underwriting side. We now see them impacting reserving. We see them impacting claims. So across the board, we come across it really no matter what the context, whether we're working with on an examination, whether we're working with a group of individuals who are on the rating side, dealing with complex rate filings. It is just something that's there all the time, and it's something that we're all working together to try to deal with. So that is my perspective, and Tricia, I will pass it back to you.
Thank you. And I realized I failed to mention a key item of evolution on the health side, namely risk adjustment. That's another area where we've seen health insurers, especially the larger ones, kind of focused on trying to do better risk adjustment estimates using complex models. Okay, so with that background, we've led the witness here a little bit. We're interested in your thoughts on, for the insurers you regulate, do you think that model risk is increasing without appropriate offsetting controls? So on a residual basis, it's increasing with appropriate offsetting controls. So maybe we have some higher inherent risk there, but in the grand scheme of things on a net basis, we're okay. About the same overall, not much change, decreasing, or not sure. So we'll give folks a second here, and just again, a reminder, make sure that you hit that submit button. Okay, so as we expected, especially since we have a lot of people on this webinar, folks are seeing the model risk going up, but I'm glad to see a good proportion believe that their insurers that they regulate are implementing some good offsetting controls to try to mitigate that model risk. And we certainly see a lot of that activity in the industry, and I realize the answer to this is going to vary a lot by the individual company, but overall to see that we see a lot of controls being put in place as well is helpful. And we do see, I'm a little surprised with the decreasing, but that's great. It certainly can happen. Again, depending on your company, I certainly could see, specific companies or maybe, certain parts of the industry not having a big change. So moving on in terms of, sharing some of what Dave and I are seeing out there in terms of industry activity. So the first bucket here is, it depends on the circumstances, but we do see that this complexity of models that we've talked about is driving companies to, in some cases, centralize their modeling. So I think historically, a lot of insurance companies, and this is probably more true for life companies than other types, but there's been kind of growth of a lot of different models across the organization used for either different products or different functions like pricing, reserving, et cetera, investment management. And so we are seeing more centralization of that in some cases for, kind of for cost and efficiency reasons. And then related to that, some of the larger companies may also now have a dedicated team that is focused 100% on model risk management. So that team might own, making sure that there's documentation in place, they own the governance requirements, they do the validations, et cetera. Now that, I would say, is mostly true at the larger organizations where they have sufficient resource for that, but that is a more common theme for some of those bigger companies. And if, a company's not larger, they may have allocated some of their existing resources to specifically oversee this as part of their roles and responsibilities. It can be more common now for actuarial to work with IT. And I say this as an actuary, we're not always the best at governance and controls and keeping things locked down. So the involvement of IT resources, I think, is a real positive. So something to maybe keep an eye out for. I think related to the second point, companies moving to put their production technology and models into a closed production environment where changes are owned by IT. So, changes can be made by someone outside of IT, but have to then run through an IT process to actually make their way into the system. That's becoming more common. I did want to share a quick example here related to reporting and analytics. So I had a situation where on an examination, I was trying to do testing of a model, and we got output from the model based on our request. And we're testing it to see if it, was performing as we expected, and found that we couldn't tie the output back to what was booked in the financial statements. And what happened was the company did not have an environment like this. They didn't have a database to store their output. And so when we requested information, they had to do a new run of their model to give us the information, and the model had been changed and they didn't know it. And so the run they gave us didn't match the numbers that were actually booked in the financials. So that obviously was a situation where they did not have a good model architecture. But again, a real life example where we can see situations where that lack of control can cause issues in the reporting. We see a lot more involvement by senior management and the board. I'm going to talk a little bit later about guidance from the Federal Reserve related to model risk management for banks. But that has had some impact on insurers and does require board oversight specifically as it relates to model risk. And then we see a lot more use of specific controls, documented formal controls around models, even beyond SOX and model audit rule. So, to this day, I see companies that respond with, well, I'm not subject to MAR because I'm small, so I don't have controls. Which obviously is not acceptable. So we do see companies implementing more on the control front, even if the model is not used for financial reporting. So how do I identify whether my company that I'm evaluating has material model risk? So there's some obvious things. So in this top part of the page, you see things that I'm sure you would expect: a lot of use of models for either reporting or decision-making. Again, this is not just about financial reporting risk. They don't have a model risk management program or a model inventory, a way to rank their models. So most companies at this point, as part of their enterprise risk management, would have something called a risk taxonomy, where they sort of say, okay, here's my top level risks. And those may align with the NAIC branded categories, or they may not, but they'll have credit risk and market risk and pricing and reserving, et cetera. And I would expect somewhere in that taxonomy that we would see model risk. It frequently falls under operational. It doesn't have to, but if they haven't identified it as a risk to which they're exposed, I would say that's a little bit of a red flag. There's no discussions at the board level, internal audit isn't involved, or even if all those things are there, but there's some history of control deficiencies or underpricing, that might also be an indicator. There also may be things that may not be as obvious, that could indicate that the company's not doing a good job managing their model risk. So if they have an inventory, but the number of models is really small, that could be an indicator. You know, for some of the big companies, I've seen inventories with several hundred models just because they use them everywhere. You know, they use them in the investment area, they use them in financial reporting, they use them in reserving, et cetera. If you see very few models, especially for a larger company, that might be a sign that they're just not doing a good job identifying them. A lot of low or medium risk rankings, they're not documenting, the oversight, you know, doesn't really involve, you know, all lines of defense. The business unit isn't involved, it's primarily in the internal audit area. And then just in terms of the regular reviews and process, if there's no reporting, there's not a specific plan for how they review their models. They don't have requirements that have to be met before they can put their model into production. Those are all indicators that they might have relatively higher model risk. So this next slide, I won't spend a lot of time here, but this was a picture that I found in some research related to model risk, and this was produced by Management Solutions. It is heavily weighted toward the banking world, so they did some surveys of financial institutions broadly, but I just found this interesting. So we see the words here are the different types of models used in the group of organizations that they surveyed. Again, all financial institutions. And then the size of the word is how many models there are for that purpose. And, you know, there's some judgment there, right? Because you could have a model that you view as like a market-related model that's also used in a risk capacity. So they're, you know, it's not a perfect slice and dice, but in general, you can see that there's, number one, a lot of places that financial institutions use models. And number two, there's some clear areas, at least broadly in financial institutions, where there's a lot of, you know, a lot of models for that particular purpose, like risk or forecasting. I do think if we saw this for an insurance company, we probably would see bigger font for things like reserving and pricing, because those processes do typically rely pretty heavily on models. So I alluded to this earlier. So this guidance, SR 11.7, is not directly applicable to insurers. It is guidance for banks. It did apply to insurers during the period of time when some of the larger ones were regulated by the Fed, or in the event that you know, an insurance group still has banking operations, they may need to worry about this. But this guidance, I found the guidance pretty useful. I do think a lot of insurers, even where they don't have to comply with this, use it as a benchmark for their model risk management processes internally. And so this does give, you know, fairly comprehensive guidance on what is required for effective model risk management. It goes through some guiding principles, which you see on the slide, and then also some additional details for each of those in terms of what is expected. So the three main areas that we expect to see a company, you know, worrying about with respect to risk management is governance, validation, and then processes around the development, implementation, and use of models. The paper talks about what a model is, and then the three main components as being the input, the processing part, and then the output. And in general, kind of to summarize this, the expectation is that model risk would be managed just like other risks. You know, it should be treated, you know, similarly in terms of its governance as things like credit risk and market risk and operational risk. So this came out back in April of 2011. And I know the Fed's been monitoring this very closely. And again, I personally have some experience with the Fed looking at this for larger life insurance companies. And they do say, kind of related to all this guidance, that even if a company has all of these practices in place, it's never going to eliminate model risk, which is a good point. I mean, a model always is going to have some level of risk even after you apply good controls and governance. So they do suggest that, or require, I should say, that the financial institutions place limits on model use. You know, they shouldn't just allow, you know, unlimited use of models for any purpose desired, and then make sure that they're monitoring the performance, and where possible, supplementing the use of a model with other sources of information to kind of check its accuracy. So with that, we will go to our next polling question. So the question here is, prior to this webinar, were you familiar with the guidance in SR 11-7? And so our options here is that you were very familiar with this guidance, somewhat familiar, not very familiar, or you had not heard of SR 11-7. So we'll see, we'll give folks a second here. And again, make sure you hit that submit button. Okay, we still have numbers moving around a little bit, so I'm just giving it one more second here. Okay, looks like we're starting to level off here. So, okay, so I should have asked this before, spending a bunch of time on this guidance actually, but I'm glad that we got the answers that we did because most folks were not particularly familiar with SR 11-7, and that's good. And might be even worse as you're talking to the companies you regulate, especially if they're larger, what they've done with this guidance. Again, it's not necessarily directly applicable to insurers, but there's a lot of good stuff in there, and I do think the bigger companies, in many cases, have at least considered it. They may not apply all of the components, but they have at least considered it in developing their own model risk management framework. And with that, I will turn it over to Dave to talk a little bit about some other guidance out there related to model risk.
Okay, thanks, Tricia. And I will talk about ASOP 56 modeling, but I wanted to start by returning to one of the points Tricia made a couple of slides ago, and that's this concept that models inherently mean risk to at least some extent. So again, no matter how good the controls are, no matter how great the team is that built the model, there's always going to be some risk. And so I thought I'd share just a personal story with encountering that concept. And it's a non-insurance example, but it actually has to do with rotisserie baseball. So rotisserie baseball, otherwise known as fantasy baseball. I will confess I've been part of a league that goes all the way back to the 1980s. I didn't actually join it until probably the mid-90s or so about 25 years for me. And what I always found was the best part of this league is the draft. And so the way the draft works is that it's an auction. Okay, so you have 11 different what we call owners. You each own a team. Each of the 11 owners bids on a player. You call up players one at a time, you bid on them until someone wins the auction, and then you move on to the next player. So you do this until you have a full roster, and it takes some time because you have 14 hitters, you have 9 pitchers, you have 11 teams. When you add it all up, you realize you have to do that over 250 times. So it takes hours and hours and hours. It is a blast, at least if you're me. So one year I was unfortunately unable to attend the auction in person. So I didn't want to disqualify myself from the league. So what I did instead was I built a model to automate the auction bidding for me, even though I wasn't there. So the way the model worked was I came up with projections for all the players, for the key statistics. I came up with a value for each player, and I had the model say, okay, I'll go up to only so far before I'll stop bidding on any given player. And I had bells and whistles to it so that, if there were only a couple shortstops left, I might bid some more for the remaining shortstop, whatever. I'll say it was fun, again, at least for me. And I was pretty proud of this model because it actually worked. I ended up with a pretty decent team, arguably better than the typical team I had when I showed up in person. But when I look back at the team that I had assembled through this model, I noticed that I had really, really excellent hitting, and I had really, really mediocre pitching. And in particular, I had lots and lots of players who could hit the ball over the fence. Okay, I had power hitters, home runs were definitely at a premium on my team, whereas the great pitchers just weren't there. And so I stepped back and I thought about why that happened. And, then you get into the psychology of it all. So I played baseball myself growing up. And when I played baseball, I had no power. I never hit home runs. I could, hit for average, but I had no power whatsoever. And so the way that manifested itself is when I built this model to draft baseball players, I valued power above everything else. And so that was a modeling bias that entered into the judgments I had to make to build this model. So however sort of, silly this sounds or whatever, I think there is a real analogy to models in any walk of life, including the insurance models that we come upon. The lesson to me is you can build this great model. You can have all the qualified people in the world. You can have great governance. Like in my case, I had only one person with the keys to the model. But you can still run into problems because you always have to make judgments. Somewhere or another, you always have to make judgments in what goes into the model and how you interpret what comes out of the model. And those judgments will influence, the way the model ultimately plays itself out. And if there is a hidden, bias of any sort in your judgments, that will manifest itself in the way the model works. So now I'm actually going to turn back to the slide that you all see and talk about how this is addressed in real actuarial life and insurance life with Actuarial Standard of Practice number 56, and that is an actuarial standard on modeling. And this is really, in my opinion, having had nothing to do with the document, it's great. It's a great document. It's actually a great reference for anyone who's listening in on this call. It doesn't matter what your role is. This Actuarial Standard of Practice has all kinds of practical information on things you should consider when you're thinking about modeling and model risk. It has been a long time coming. You can see there's been significant work over the last 3 years, and I'd say work even predates that, but several exposure drafts came out. It covers things like how do you design models, how do you develop them, what do you do in selecting assumptions, how do you review them, how do you evaluate the output. And it has a very broad definition of what constitutes a model, which makes sense. It's trying to be broad. It's recognizing that it's not so easy to come up with, when we say model all the time, but what do you actually mean? So it has a definition, and the definition, like I said, is meant to encompass a broad range of models. So reliance, intended purpose, understanding the model, et cetera. A lot of really good things in there. It's not even effective yet. It becomes effective in October, but it's there right now for the taking, as it were. So again, whether you're an actuary or a non-actuary, I seriously recommend you take a look at it. And I also think we happen to have an individual who is presenting on this call who was involved in the development of this standard in her role on the Actuarial Standards Board, which she chaired. So that's not me, that's Tricia. So Tricia, did you want to offer your perspective on this standard?
Sure. Yeah, I was, so the way the Actuarial Standards Board works is that actuaries join that for up to 2 3-year terms. So I was on the board for 6 years. The last 2, I was the chair. And during the latter part of that, this standard was in the works. It wasn't done. It kept going after I rolled off. But the comment I'll add is, because I was kind of there seeing like the sausage being made, is that the really tricky part about writing guidance for how you have to, mitigate model risk or appropriate actuarial procedures associated with models is that, a simple little spreadsheet that takes a couple of inputs and calculates a number could be a model. And then you could have, a super sophisticated, economic capital model that models every product in your company over a huge range of scenarios and looks at the tail. And the guidance that we have does apply to both. But that was a significant area of debate as the guidance was being written, because if you have very prescriptive requirements around validations and documentations and, the approach to validating inputs, et cetera, it's going to put a lot of burden on someone that's got that little spreadsheet model. But if you don't have that, then you're not going to have enough guidance for the person that's got the economic capital model. So what ended up happening, there was a lot of back and forth about whether the scope should be restricted. And at the end of the day, what the guidance says is that the actuary applies judgment in terms of the extent to which the guidance applies. So there are some basic things that everybody has to do, but a lot of the more, like complicated, robust guidance that might only be needed for either a more complicated model or one that's heavily relied upon. So it's not just about the complexity, it's also about how heavily it's relied upon. You would have to do more for something more sophisticated, more heavily relied upon, and you can apply judgment to do less for something that doesn't meet those criteria. So again, that is part of why it took quite a while to issue this guidance.
Thank you for that, Tricia. Okay, so a little more about what's in this standard. This concept of intended purpose, which you see in the middle, is really a foundation for everything else, and I think that makes some good sense. I mean, you build a model with a purpose in mind. You always want to make sure that what you do fits in with that intended purpose. So whether that purpose is, we want to do a better job of pricing this block of business that's been crushing our profitability over the last 3 years, or whatever it may be. You always start with that intended purpose in mind. And then starting from the top and working our way around, designing and developing the model. So, one question that comes up right away is how complex a model is needed given the purpose. And for that, you might consider, okay, well, how saturated is the market that we're in? How sophisticated are our competitors? What do we have to do in order to make sure that we are going to get a good slice of this business? How far do we have to take it? Selecting and reviewing, this has to do with really governance and how much, how many levels of review are needed, what information is going to go into the model, just making sure that the process is in place that fits the intended purpose for the model. And then, of course, how is it going to be used? Who is going to use it? How are they going to use it? Is it, given the model and what needs to be constructed, how easy is it for users to interpret the output? All these questions come up. Again, coming back, it all comes back to the intended purpose, the structure of the model, the data that goes in, a critical question no matter what we're talking about, a question that's very much on people's minds as we think about models and the use of insurance data versus non-insurance data. That's led to all kinds of issues and concerns, as many on the phone know. Yet it has to come back. It has to come back, and a company needs to demonstrate why the data that it's using fits the intended purpose of the model. And finally, the assumptions. Getting back to the story I had earlier, the assumptions will always end up driving what that model produces. So making sure that those assumptions make sense, are grounded in real logic, and fit the information both in terms of individual assumptions and assumptions in the aggregate. These are the types of things that we all want to make sure are happening, and these are the things that have some discussion and guidance in the actuarial standard of practice related to modeling. So again, it has a great deal of excellent information, practical information to consider as one is developing these models.
And Dave, I'm going to sneak in, sorry, one more quick comment related to like intended purpose and the model design. So there's just kind of a today, like very relevant example of where some of these things like might go wrong. So like it's very, very common in, for health insurers to use, a historical like claim lag model for estimating their reserves, their ultimate claims paid. And so you may have a model that's the intended purpose, and you've got a series of historical data that's been used to do that. And right now we have this issue where because of the pandemic, there was this big pause in most elective health procedures. And so then you start to have a question like, is that model that relies on like sort of a repeatable and stable history of claim development, the correct model for the purpose of trying to estimate IBNR today, where we have not like suddenly we have these gaps in the data. I mean, you could argue that's the intended purpose. You could argue it's the design or even the data. But again, that's an example of things that we'd want to consider in terms of whether that the model is fit for the purpose we're using it. So I just wanted to throw that in there since it's kind of timely.
Yep. Thanks for that, Tricia. So one more slide on the modeling ASOP. It includes a section on the evaluation and risk mitigation considerations. And these considerations have a lot to do with the complexity of the model and back to the idea of what was the purpose. How far does the actuary need to go in mitigating the risk associated with the model? That has to do with it, where does the model rank in terms of its importance to the company, and how complex is it? That will go a long way towards determining how far one needs to go with the testing and with risk mitigation. So you see several areas that are covered within the ASOP. There's actually more to it than even what we show here. But things like, what are you going to do to make sure the output of the model makes sense? And we have some of the tools at one's disposal in doing so. Things like holdout data sets, where a model is constructed on a portion of the available information, and then it's run on another portion of the available information that was held out, and do the results look comparable to one another. Other statistical tests showing whether or not the model is working appropriately. These are things that are pretty much par for the course whenever you start getting into complex models, things that you can expect companies are doing, and they should be able to demonstrate for you what they did and how they interpreted the results. And one other item I will mention on here, the concept of independent review. And I've seen this a lot in the context of financial exams, where companies have important models that are impacting some aspect of their operations. We've seen several instances where the company said, you know what, we have a team that we really trust working on this, but we're going to take the step of going out and having an independent firm validate the model. And so they engage experts who work for consulting firms or whoever it may be, and those experts put together a report that describes their work in validating the model and commentary on, and there's usually really good information in there, not just yes, no, does the model look like it's working, but also here are some things to consider. Here are potentially some shortcomings in the data. I've just found those personally to be very, very useful. And so a question to ask any company that you're involved in that's using models, especially those that are of a complex nature, is have you gone out and gotten an independent review of this model? And if you haven't, are you planning to do so anytime soon? And one last comment is that another thing firms will do is they won't, models have to develop over time. Models have to be updated. Sometimes models have to be shelved completely and you start over. Sometimes they're tweaked. So there's this whole evolution that of necessity takes place with models. And so just because a model was validated once 5 years ago doesn't mean the model is necessarily perfect, right on the money right now. And so this brings up all kinds of questions, not just what has the company done to update the model, but also, okay, you got that independent validation, but that was 5 years ago. When's the next one? Would be a question. And it's not necessarily that it's mandated, but it is it is certainly a way that I would see as a good practice, certainly to consider, especially for the really important models. We did want to mention other guidance that's out there. So the first example you see here is the internal audit perspective. So it is a document known as the Auditing Model Risk Management Practice Guide. And this has a information on the internal controls, of course, are heavily emphasized in here, but it really takes the modeling process start to finish. Just as I think of ASOP 56 really taking you from start to finish, the development of a model all the way through the use of the model and subsequent testing, you can find similar types of information in this first item that we mentioned. Second item is a solvency view of the world, so internal models, and obviously of interest to those of us on the phone who are all trying to keep our companies solvent. This document provides guidance on what expectations supervisors should have of companies in terms of when they have a key model, one that helps project how much capital they need or how much capital is at risk. What are the expectations you should have as the supervisor on what the company can provide to you to show you what they did to ensure as best they can that model is functioning properly. And lastly, another actuarial standard that is out there is the use of models outside the actuary's area of expertise. We note that ASOP 38 is property and casualty centric, though there are plans to open it up to the other areas of insurance. But the main thing with ASOP 38, a lot of it is geared toward, or at least traditionally was thought of to be pointed towards catastrophe models. So think of all the companies out there exposed to natural catastrophe events or non-natural catastrophe events. It is quite normal and typical for companies to rely on sophisticated CAT models. We know there are major vendors out there. There's a whole CAT modeling industry. So if you're the actuary and you have to say something about what those models are telling you and the company, for instance, what's your loss in a 1 in 200 year type event, how far do you have to go as the actuary, right? You're not a weather expert. You don't understand all of the the engineering and all the science that sits behind the CAT model. So what do? Do you just punt and say that's what the model told me? This standard gives guidance on how far you do need to go, and the basic answer is you cannot punt 100%. You do need to go through some activity to make sure you have at least a grounding in what the model is doing and what it's based on. And I'll pause there after all that and see if Tricia wants to weigh in on any of that.
No, you covered it well.
Okay.
But I think I'm picking up from here.
There you go.
So this next slide is meant to kind of represent a generic modeling process. It may not look that way. I know there's a lot here, but that is what it's meant to do. And I'll just refer again back to the comments I made on that SR 11-7 document. So that document, and again, this is not rocket science here. It describes the modeling or the model as having its inputs, its processing, and then its outputs or reporting. And so what we see here is a series of inputs. So most of those boxes on the left, all the way till we get to the big blue box in the middle. So that big blue box in the middle is kind of the modeling applications, or the kind of the code, the calculation engine. And then on the right-hand side, we see information coming out of the models and ultimately being reported in different ways. And so what you see for the red stars is, places where we would expect the company to have controls. And, in many cases, especially where these models are used for financial reporting, I think that that's done reasonably well. I would say when you move away from financial reporting, or sometimes for smaller companies, it may not be done so well. So, as information is going into the model, the policy data, market data, asset data, it may go straight in. A lot of the times companies now have like a database where they capture and store data, and they transform it to be in a suitable format for the model. But all of that work should involve checks along the way to make sure the data stays accurate and complete. And I know I'm talking to a group of people that are probably a lot smarter on accuracy and completeness testing than I am. But again, the key is like, even if we're not talking about a number that's getting booked in the financials, all these models should have something there that is checking the accuracy of the data that's going in. Maybe a little harder is that box on the top, approach and assumptions. But there again, and I think the industry is getting better at this, but isn't there yet, there's a lot of assumptions that have to go into a model, and somehow you have to have an oversight framework for that. So, maybe it's an assumption governance committee that looks at those assumptions and makes sure that they're okay. And then you may have situations where, one person is putting assumptions into a model, another person is making sure that the right ones went in. But again, we want to make sure we're controlling everything that's going in. Within the calculation engine itself, we expect that companies are testing that. So best practice, it's ideal, again, if you have this production environment where you can't modify it. And outside of that, if you're making updates, they're made, they're tested, they're validated, checked by the appropriate parties, and then only when everybody's comfortable that they're working properly do they get put into production, and then the production version gets tested, maybe with an independent calc, maybe with some kind of backcasting. But anyway, checking that calculation engine. And then similarly, as things are coming out, we want to make sure that there's comparative or reconciliation controls to make sure that information coming out of the models is being captured properly and used properly. I have this funny example. It relates to sort of the control environment, but I was in a situation once where an organization very carefully put passwords on all their modeling applications to make sure that only those that were supposed to access the models could access the models. And then the passwords were saved in a Word document named passwords on a LAN that virtually everyone in the company had access to. So again, obviously we want the control to be there and we want it to work effectively. So that was an example where maybe the work effectively part was not quite there. Okay, a couple more resources. I'll move through this kind of quickly because I want to make sure we get to a couple of critical slides at the end here. But there's a more recent document. It's not required guidance. There's a practice note. This is also more actuarial in nature, but I think the content is very helpful generally for model risk management. So the American Academy of Actuaries published a practice note. I think it was officially published in 2019. That just talks about the practices out there related to model risk management. And again, unlike some of the other guidance we've talked about, this is not something that a company should do. It's more describing what a range of companies out there do in practice. But again, a lot of good thoughts there, reference material. And so this just gives an overview of some of the things that we want to see. Maybe the one item on here that we haven't talked about yet is model risk quantification. And just the only point I'll make there is, we heard in the banking guidance, we want to see model risk treated like other risks. So in the event that the company, as part of their ERM program, is looking at like the likelihood and severity of different types of risk, they should be doing that with model risk as well. And that may be judgmental. There may not be a way to put like real dollars on what you might lose because of high model risk. But again, treating it seriously like you would all of your other significant risks is important. And then this slide, an appendix to that practice note includes a sample model validation plan. So just a few comments on this. One is that, model validation doesn't happen and then it's done and, you kind of like put it away on the shelf and you're good. It's an ongoing process, which is what we see, depicted by the circle. And it's also very hard for companies that are newer to this to kind of do it all at once. I mean, I don't know many companies out there that have gotten through all their models. Most are still in the midst of that, or some have only focused on high-risk models. But having some formal plan and specific owners and accountability, so that's the planning part, where you're going to go through and at a minimum for the higher risk models that you've identified through this model inventory that we talked about, that you're looking at the inputs, the calculation engine, the outputs, and then making recommendations back to the model owner that then get implemented, and at some point the cycle occurs again. And then I wanted to share here one more story. So I was doing work with a company that had I would call a very strong independent function to check their models. And they happened to be a company that had a very complex product and a very complex hedging program. And they independently replicated the hedging model results because it was so critical to managing their risk. And so they were doing independent replications. They had a team of very, very smart people doing that. And their validation process didn't go all the way back to the inputs. And the key piece they were missing were the contractual provisions. So they had, they were checking the calculations, and they were checking, interest rates, and they were checking, like policy data, but they didn't check to make sure they had captured the features of the contract, and ended up finding that there was a feature that was completely missed by both the original modelers and the checkers, and it created a huge, huge like mismatch in their hedging. So anyway, that review inputs part, back to the source can be pretty critical depending on the model. And then this slide here goes through a document that was published by the CRO Council back in 2012. So the CRO Council is a North American body. It's actually called the North American CRO Council. It's a group of U.S. CROs that work together to publish relevant guidance related to ERM. Share practices, where they can within reason. And so they put together a set of principles that are meant to be validation principles for risk and capital models. But most of these, if not all of them, are, I think, pretty equally applicable to models in general. So we did want to point folks to this guidance. And a lot of this we've talked about already, but I was going to make one more quick comment here related to building for the intended purpose. So another hot topic that we see today is some of the challenges associated with long-term care writers. And I know I personally do quite a bit reviewing reserve adequacy for long-term care. And, if the goal of the reserve adequacy analysis for long-term care is to, the intended purpose is to assess whether, considering, a moderately adverse set of risks, I have enough reserves for my long-term care. Probably that's going to include interest rate risk. That tends to be one of the big ones. And there's a decent number of organizations out there that don't use cash flow testing or, a significant range of interest rate scenarios in the analysis. So I'm just pointing that out as an example of where you may say, okay, because rates have come down so far and the exposure is so high and the intended purpose is the adequacy of the reserve, perhaps a more simplistic deterministic model is not meeting the intended purpose. So I thought I'd throw in one more current relevant example there. And then this slide is just a sample of what we're talking about when we talk about a model risk scorecard. This one, as you can tell from the content here, is specific to life insurance, but just gives you a sense for what this might look like and how we might be scoring the risks based on a series of criteria for these different types of models. And again, this is not prescribed. This is just a sample, and different companies may have different criteria, but just so you get a sense for what we're talking about. So we'll move on here to our next polling question. So which branded risk category do you think is most impacted by associated model risk? Operational, pricing, reserving, strategic, litigation, unsure, or can't decide. So we'll give folks a second here. And again, you got to hit that submit button to have it go through. Alrighty here, and in the interest of time, I'm just going to give it another few seconds here. I do want folks to have a chance to get their submission in, but I also know we have a couple more slides before we close out. Okay, last call. Choose one of those branded risk categories. Okay, so we have quite a mix here. And, I don't have a big, strong view on this either. I think it's hard. It's hard. All these categories certainly could be impacted by associated model risk. So I probably would have fallen into F myself. Okay, so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dave to wrap us up here.
Okay, thanks, Tricia. And I will go very rapidly here, as I know we have at least one question in the hopper that we want to answer before we finish up. So some of the potential consequences, at least, of unmitigated model risk are shown on this slide. And rather than reading through all of them, I'll just say, you know, when you think about unmitigated model risk, of course, one of the things that comes to mind for many, if not most of us, would be the financial crisis. So you can always pull that out and say, okay, there is an example where, you know, through no bad intentions or anything like that, models just did not pick up the possibility of what could happen under a certain set of circumstances. And you know, I think about that today, every day now, as we live through what we're all living through, and just wondering when the dust settles and we look back, you know, how well did the models that companies set up to try to measure risks and appropriately protect themselves from risks handle something like this that is you know, if not impossible, pretty darn difficult to predict, at least in terms of the way it impacted different sectors of the economy, and not the least the insurance industry. Just a couple more slides, and then we'll have one final polling question. So understanding model risk, we put this slide here so that everyone on the phone, you know, everyone and many of you have already done it, and if you haven't done it, everyone is equipped to question companies about their models. And some of the key questions that you can ask are shown in the left-hand column of this slide. So again, I will not read through them, but the slides are here. It'll be here as a reference for anyone who's interested, and you can get a sense for some of the things you might expect your companies to be able to, the kinds of information that they should be able to provide to you. And then testing. What about testing model risk when you come down to it? What can you do? On this slide, we list several of the things that can be done. And typically this, you know, as I think Tricia alluded to this earlier, it usually involves a multidisciplinary team to test these models, right? So the examination team, no doubt about it. IT specialists, absolutely. Actuarial specialists, sure. You know, that kind of interdisciplinary effort can take you a long way in understanding and testing model risk. Okay, so one more polling question for everyone. Have you evaluated model risk during the course of your regulatory work to date? So give this a few seconds, and if everyone can hit submit.
Yeah, and Dave, I think we had a little bit of a challenge for a couple folks on polling question 4. So just, I'm thinking maybe we leave this open and we can maybe do the Q&A while it's open so that we can be a little more certain people have time to respond.
Sure.
What do you think?
Yeah, I think I would not disagree with you. So why don't we start tackling at least whatever questions we can get to. So one question we have is, do you expect insurance groups to include extensive narrative on model risk management in their ORSA? I think that is a great question for those who file ORSA. I'll answer first, and then Tricia jump in. On my side, I usually see at least some degree of description of model risk management, and in particular with respect to the economic capital models that companies, to the extent they're using such a model, to come up with their estimate of how much capital they need under different scenarios, or regulatory capital, or whatever it may be. We usually look for a description there, and if there isn't a description of the model risk management process that's in place, that would be a kind of no-brainer follow-up question that I would tend to recommend. So, Tricia, do you want to give your perspective?
Sure. Yeah. So if I didn't see any mention of it, I think that's a red flag. I mentioned that before with the risk taxonomy. How extensive, I think, is going to vary quite a bit. what I've seen, I'm not saying this is great, but what I've seen is like a company that's done a good job with it talks about it, and a company that hasn't doesn't. So if I didn't see much, I probably would ask some questions about it because they use models. I think we know that. They use models. So they should be looking at it in some shape or form.
Okay, great. I see a few questions about the presentation, so I believe we'll be able to make these slides available to everyone. And I see we are past our time here, so I think, oh, this last comment, we got some answers to that last polling question, and it looks like about a third of the group has been involved in reviewing model risks to some extent, and another third has been involved at least indirectly. So we have good representation on the call here. We appreciate everyone participating, and we will close it all. So thank you very much.